Okay, I think it's time to get started, right?
Yes,
I think
sir.
so. Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's 9 o'clock.
Right. There we go. 9 o'clock in the US, and I am currently sitting in Ireland where it's 2 p.m. So thank you for the folks in Europe that are joining in, and obviously the folks in the morning in the United States. First and foremost, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. We look forward to presenting how Seraph sees the current industry and where it's going, but more importantly, through our survey and talking to our clients, our industry partners, and have done this survey to understand how they see the industry. And so the purpose and the benefit for our audience here is to get a benchmark or a neutral view of what the industry looks like. And hopefully this can be something that you can use when you're developing your internal strategies and just benchmarking towards the industry. So anyways, thank you all. My name is Thomas Koval. I've been in the automotive industry my entire career. I live in Michigan, but originally from Sweden. Started my career in operations and have also spent a lot of time in business development. For the folks that don't know who Seraph is, we are an operational consulting company. We really see ourselves as problem solvers. And to put that into context, what does that mean? We're involved a lot in moving facilities, developing a footprint for our clients for their manufacturing. At times, we have to support them with consolidating factories, launching new factories, helping them launch projects that might not have gone the way they had hoped. We work a lot in crisis situations, but as well throughout the last several years, what's been really fun is to be involved in some of the new technology being introduced to the market as well. So really fun. And then obviously a focus of this presentation today, and there will be an element to this, is also the costing. And today I am joined with my great and a good colleague and great friend, Wade Phillips, who's our president in Ireland. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Hi, I'm Wade Phillips, and I'm responsible for our Seraph operations in Europe. And I hope it doesn't slip past anybody that our European guy is sitting in Troy, Michigan, and our North American guy is sitting in Dublin, Ireland, just by chance. So I've been in the automotive industry for the vast majority of my career over the past 30 years or so, until I joined Seraph about 5 years ago. Like Thomas said, as manufacturing operations consultancy, we get to work with a lot of the different OEMs and suppliers, which provides us some industry insights that we're going to share with you over the next hour or so. So as we discuss these topics, as we go through, as we finish a topic, we're going to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions and even provide comments, because to be honest with you, we're as interested in getting your perspective as you are ours. So we love hearing from folks in industry and give us additional insights that we can include in our reports going forward. If you have a question or comment, there's a couple of forums. There are two aspects of this webinar. One is MS Teams. Some folks are on MS Teams, some are on LinkedIn. Both of which have chat capability. So just leave them there, and we have people, a few folks standing by to monitor those questions and comments, and we'll address those as we go through. But after each topic, we'll take a quick break and talk about that topic to the extent that anybody's interested to provide a comment or question. And then the last thing I'll say is Thomas and I are both extremely grateful for the folks that at Seraph that have helped put this together. It's taken whenever we do these reports, it takes a village, and so folks have really come to the table and provided a really good report for us to be able to present today. So thanks to everybody if you're on and had anything to do with putting this together. We very much appreciate the effort. So with that, let's get started.
Yeah. So as a summary of how we see the industry today, we've divided it into three main areas. Human capital, so we're going to be going through that. And then as Wade mentioned, there will be some questions and comments there. But really from a short-term standpoint, I think on everybody's radar screen, it's obviously the UAW negotiations. And as we're talking with our clients, how do you prepare for those potential outcomes if there is truly a strike? How do you handle that as a company? Skilled labor will be a theme throughout the presentation as well. We have seen huge issues not just in the US but also now in Mexico and Canada, and Wade, I think you're seeing the same thing in Europe as well, right?
That's correct. We've got a couple of projects that we're involved in right now in Europe, and that is the single major issue, is the skilled labor shortages.
Yeah. And then when we look at EV and now the outlook and from the survey and the discussions that we've had with industry, it's been really quite interesting. There is a lot of uncertainty still related to what are the volumes really going to be, how much delays are we going to see from the OEMs, and then how do you then tackle that from a CapEx standpoint, from a training and development and so forth standpoint. And then the portion that I find very interesting myself as well is obviously the growth of China, who pretty much skipped the ICE and went straight to EV, and are about 10 to 15, some people even say 20 years ahead of us. And what does that mean for the market in regards to exports, imports, and the capital investments that many of the global OEMs have made? And then one theme that we keep hearing about, and it's from both sides, really, if it's from the OEMs and also from the supply base, the difficulties with the cost structures, what's happening with raw material, shipping, but also, of course, the price of labor, and how is that impacted and changed in some of the low-cost countries that the industry depends on. So thank you, Wade. Here you can read this through a little bit more later, but these are just some of the quotes we got from our industry clients. I think one of the interesting one was the one OEM calls it the Tesla effect. What's happening in Mexico right now with them deciding to build in Monterrey, meaning that Tesla comes in and that has an impact on wage due to the competition. But really, this isn't just Tesla. Lots of companies are nearshoring and investing in Mexico, and that's having a big impact. And then I gotta love one of the engineers that gave the quote, at some point, rubber hits the road. Better make sure the damn thing runs and has some profitability to it. I like that quote, but what I really like is in the discussion was truly focus on problem solving. We have seen a little bit of a lack in the operation standpoint of really giving people an opportunity to, some people fight the fires or run the business, but then really focus on problem solving. And I think that's what he wanted to hit on there. So nice quotes there. Thank you, Wade. Okay, so we spent a lot of time and effort by the team to put together a survey. You will see survey results throughout this presentation, so this isn't just the only survey result that you will see. But from an OEM standpoint, they are focusing heavily on cost control. That is to be able to put themselves in the best position for this unstable or unclear EV launch path. So as we look into 25, 26, 27, lots of EVs launching, but the question is the take rate, and the question is if some of these launches are going to be delayed. So huge focus now, cost control to keep an eye on cash. And currently, many OEMs are still struggling with inputs, material availability from the suppliers. And that will continue as we move into EV as well. Now, one thing that I was a bit surprised about was the equipment and facility readiness. I would have thought that would have been a little bit higher because of some of the things that we've been involved in. So that was a little bit surprising to me.
Now, from a supplier perspective, the survey respondents suggest that manpower stability and material availability are their top two challenges. That's pretty consistent with what we see in our observations with our clients, but cost control and profitability are a major focus as well, which may actually be the result of the top two in many cases. And the reason for that is because OEM profitability is largely healthy if you look at the profitability and what they announce as their profitability, but suppliers aren't necessarily as profitable. So we're seeing a lot of suppliers go back to the OEMs for price increases and in both North America and Europe due to inflation in material and labor, those things that we'll talk quite a bit about later. But another thing that surprised us, in addition to the equipment and facility readiness at the OEMs, was the leadership competency ranked low, which is inconsistent with what we see in our observations when we talk to clients and do assessments in facilities and that kind of thing. So it may very well just be the result of the survey because of the word competency, because that we're not necessarily indicting the capability or competency of particular people in leadership positions, but really it's a matter of leadership vacancies in a lot of cases. We see a lot of leadership vacancies, and many companies are turning to interim management solutions to provide the leadership required to support their operations. We've seen since 2009, actually the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we've seen leadership levels leave the workforce, and that was exacerbated by the pandemic recently. And that brain drain drives situations where lower level folks in the organization are being promoted into leadership positions without training or limited training. And that's similar to every level in the organization. And what we've noted in our work is that HR departments at one time were focused on people development, training, those kinds of things. Now they've become somewhat cost control measures, and so training will be a significant thing that is required from a leadership competency perspective.
And the first section here for human capital, that we'll get into the data. If we look at where the UAW discussions are going, from a Seraph standpoint, we're anticipating a complete attack by UAW on the big three. I think that it will last somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks. It's quite interesting to try to think about it from a business case standpoint. If you are a UAW worker and when you are on strike, you lose about 40% of your pay. So the question is, how long can you withstand losing 40% of your pay versus the business case of potentially gaining a pretty good pay increase and having a return on that investment, say within a year. And that question came from Jack Casiopo on our team to kind of look at it more from a business case standpoint. And I really appreciated that one because we have to look at it from their standpoint as well. And as we talked about, labor challenges is still continuing here. When we look at maintenance and controls engineers, that's extremely tight across the industry. And to continue on what Wade was saying there as well, that's a huge opportunity from a HR standpoint to really start developing training programs, trainee apprenticeship programs within your company to improve that a little bit more. So if we go to the next page. We actually took the opportunity, or Justin on our team gave us an interesting statistical quote here. And that was when we went back to earlier in the year, in the May timeframe, we saw some participation, obviously, in the union video conferences and things that they were having. But the one from last week or a week and a half ago, we saw 4 times as much involvement in those videos. And that means that Sean Fain is really starting to build up the team under him and get people engaged. So this is obviously not a good sign, and we're hoping for good solutions between the OEMs and UAW, but it's not going in the right direction when we look at some of the statistics now. If we go to the next slide. Most of you know that a lot of this is saturated in the Midwest area. So you can see on a map here where we see the top UAW states. But the message from us here is, yes, there are going to be tough times between the big 3 and the supply base, but and for the suppliers. But even if you're supplying German OEMs or Japanese OEMs, there can be suppliers that are heavily impacted by the unions, and then when they later have to ramp back up again, that can affect BMW, VW, Toyota as well, because their suppliers are unstable, similar to what we saw coming out of the COVID pandemic. Go to the next slide. So we've seen union participation dropping, but overall, union activity has increased, as you can see here on the right side. And I'm sure most of you are following the news and you're hearing about the railway negotiations, you're hearing about the trucking, and even the Hollywood drama that's currently been going on as well. So we've seen increase in activity as well. Go to the next slide. This slide to me is the most interesting one, and Harrison Catlin on our team actually did a very good study to understand, based upon the size of the fund and then UAW deciding on potentially shutting down all or purely General Motors or a portion of this. What does that mean in regards to the fund depleting and doing a strike here? And what we see is somewhere around 100 days if they decide to attack all 3. Next slide, please. Just in general here, what's fascinating to me to take a look at, I remember studying this in 2018-19, what we call the automotive alley, say from Toronto through Michigan and through the Midwest down in Tennessee, Alabama. We are seeing similar unemployment rates, and actually right before the pandemic, when we were studying Alabama, we saw negative unemployment rates. That's quite difficult. And then on the chart over to the right, you will see, yes, unfortunately, there is a portion of our workforce that have not returned to work yet, creating more instability and difficulties to find labor. And when we're talking about labor, it's not just purely about operators and maintenance. Many of our projects that we're involved in, we see a real lack in strong logistics, material planners, production schedulers, and that's having an impact on the supply base. Next slide, please. This should be no surprise to anyone here. These are real numbers of year-over-year wage growth by industry here. So from a manufacturing standpoint, we've seen a very strong rise here. If we go to the next slide. To me, that was definitely heavily involved in the industry back in 17 and 18. When I saw this slide put together by the team, I was very surprised by how much since 2016 that we've seen for what's known as, say, low-cost countries, the increase in wages. It's been quite rapid. And Wade, I think you've seen the same thing in Europe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see quite a few of those towards the top end of that graph are low-cost countries in Europe. But I think what we've seen, though, is that even though those are increasing faster than some of the other established industrial countries, they're still competitive at the moment.
Yeah. Right. So coming back to your point there, this slide shows that on the left side you see the Mexico annual wage growth. However, on the slide to the right, we compare the Mexico average wage rate compared to the OECD countries. And the message that we're saying here is that it's still good to do business in Mexico. However, if we look at it from the previous slide, and when we look at this slide, Seraph anticipates this wage growth to continue. We don't see it plateauing or coming down. We're seeing it actually continually increasing in the next couple of years. This is just more.
Sorry, Hagen here. I don't see the screen anymore, the slides anymore. Am I the only one? When I'm the only one, I solve the problem by myself. But
good question. Does anybody not see the screen that's on the Teams call here? I can see it, but that might be preferential treatment. I don't know.
So I'm on Teams and I can see it as well.
I've got it on mine.
You see it?
Oh.
My problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Hagen. Thank you. Okay, so when we look at Mexico, unemployment rate is obviously dropping since the pandemic, and if you look at the right chart, we're able to see some of the changes in implementation of timing that's made by the Mexican government now. So really, if we look at it, it's kind of a supply and demand situation. The president wants to get votes, and so he currently has a lot of demand, meaning a lot of companies want to come into Mexico, do business, so there's a lot of demand. And from a supply side, then he can increase the pricing. So meaning that he's trying to provide more for the employees in the sense of hiring bonuses, yearly bonuses to the operators, reduced working hours, and so forth. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and from a European perspective, like North America, labor availability remains a challenge, obviously, especially in skilled labor. And the effect of unemployment decreases and workforce participation decreases, similar to what Thomas just went through with North America, that obviously causes a situation where wages are forced to rise. And we've seen 5.3% since last year in the EU so far. And we don't expect that to necessarily decrease. That's going to continue to inflate year over year because workforce participation continues to decline and unemployment continues to decline as well because of negative population growth in many areas and that kind of thing. So job vacancy rates are at a record high, and in many cases, as mentioned before, companies are turning to interim management solutions and contract labor and that kind of thing to try to offset that. But overall, in the low-cost country perspective, we talked about that on a couple of slides ago with regard to their inflation is actually higher than most, but still remain competitive at the moment. But in anticipation of that, we're seeing in Europe, looking at places like Northern Africa and other places to try to expand into further low-cost country areas. So that's kind of the data and commentary we had around human capital. Are there any questions out on Diarmuid or Letitia? Are there any questions out on LinkedIn or Teams? No? Okay. Are there any questions or comments actually from the audience that we can entertain at the moment around the human capital subject that we just talked about?
Wait, Hagen here again. Sorry. Now, by the way, I see the pictures now.
Perfect.
Just a comment regarding North Africa you just made. I'm a bit skeptical there in regards to production to move to North Africa, especially because of logistic, number one, and number two, because of political instability in some of the locations. And I think what we all, for the moment, a bit underestimate is a local for local with higher level of automation and digitalization. I think that could be a more interesting trend than just going low cost to the east. I'm talking about Europe.
Yeah. And yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Hagen. And we don't really address, I think we did in the last, in our last report, we talked about the impact of automation and some of those things to offset the need for labor. And yeah, I completely agree with you. But we are seeing, and I also agree with your comments with regard to political instability and logistics. And some could say that you have the same issue with China, right? Political instability and logistics. But I would suggest to you that what we're actually seeing is European OEMs moving to North America or North Africa. So there is some significant interest in the industry to doing that.
As a market, no?
Yeah. Well, no, as a supply zones. People are looking strongly, companies, OEMs are looking strongly at Morocco. And then also we see the Saudis coming on very strong, right? Making significant investment with regard to growing reducing their dependence on fossil fuel production and starting to put significant investment into bringing industries into Saudi Arabia. We're seeing a lot of activity around that.
Okay, thank you. That was my comment.
Yeah, thank you. Great comment. And
yeah.
At the same time, we received a question as well related to how long or how do we see the impact of the UAW potential strike, or if there is a strike, on the industry. I think we're all waiting to see, depending on the length of it and so forth. Clients that I've spent time with are preparing by some of the ones that are in more financial difficulties, are trying to get more loans and prepare on having some cash. Obviously, it's going to have an impact when you ramp back up again from an efficiency standpoint and from a production standpoint. Just in general, it's not going to be as strong. And I think that the OEMs are preparing for some of that as well by storing some additional material. I know that people are not seeing that maybe in the releases, but these guys are smart and they have thought about this about 10 months ago. They started thinking about some of this stuff. So if the strike goes on for a long time, the biggest fear is of the companies that might go under and the crisis type of situation that we'll have. I know that the OEMs will send in teams and figure out ways to move tools and so forth, but that could impact the volume as well. So say a few companies go under, the strike is over, we'll go back to production again. The planned volume that you have for your financial planning could still have an impact 1 or 2 months after. And then there was one more question here regarding how we see a lot of the industry moving southeast, just in south, I guess more towards Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, from a labor standpoint. As mentioned earlier, from already in 2019, before the pandemic, we saw negative unemployment in some of these cities and states. I know some of the OEMs are running production there. It's very difficult to find people. And when the OEMs are struggling, the suppliers are really going to struggle as well. So that's, I foresee that continuing, but I would advise anyone doing their calculations that you're going to have more training and more incentives to keep people as well. Wade, do you see it similarly, or?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, we got another question around regarding the challenges. In your opinion, is there a shortage in leadership and management levels as there is with direct labor? And like we said in kind of the beginning of the presentation, we our experience is that human resources has become a bit of a cost control measure versus talent development in many companies. And yes, we absolutely see as much of an issue, if not worse, in leadership than with direct labor. So, like we'd mentioned, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, we were surprised at our survey that leadership competency, but again, that may have been the result of how we phrased the questions, ranked so low. And the reason is because we see a tremendous amount of leadership vacancies when we go into facilities, and companies are turning to interim management solutions to combat that, as well as promoting lower level folks into positions that haven't been trained to be able to do that. So yeah, we definitely do see that.
And I think that's the biggest thing that we see, people being promoted quite quickly into roles and not getting an opportunity to shadow somebody that knows what they're really doing, literally just getting thrown in there and try to figure it out. And so then there's a lack of maintaining processes that were there before, and then also learning the nuances of that specific job. Maybe there's one supplier, one pre-production whip area that's of trouble, and now you're falling back into the old issues that you had before that you already solved one. And then there's a lack of people to actually solve those problems. So yeah, do we want to move on to the next section here? There's one more question. Do you think the slow adoption of automation is being delayed primarily by design, higher product cost, or by skilled labor, lack of PLC programmers? Very, very good question, whoever wrote that one. I think it has a lot to do with CapEx. Yes, there is a lack of maintenance and so forth, but I think the slow progress in automation has to do with just funding CapEx and then just being overall nervous exactly how this industry is going to move. Is EV really going to have the take rate that they're anticipating? So everybody's a little bit more cautious until they understand how will EV launch, what will happen with our CapEx that we've already invested, and what do we do then in regards to more automation and better efficiency. That's how I take it. Wade, you?
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think I think people are apprehensive about the investment to move to automation. I do think that the things that you brought up are whoever asked the question that you brought up are certainly factors. Because lead times for automation are increasing because of the lack of PLC programmers and some of those, and semiconductors and all those other things that go into that automation. So those are good points, but I think it's really an apprehension to make those investments in a tumultuous time in the industry as we make the transition to EVs and obviously, as we've seen in the EV industry, as we make that transition, the volumes are volatile. Because of supply chain issues, pandemic issues, semiconductors, whatever they may be, and also, as we're going to talk about here in the next section, a little bit around people's apprehension to buy them at the moment. So sales. Yeah.
Thank you all for all the great questions.
Yeah,
and,
great questions.
Thank you, Hagen, for jumping in as well with a good comment.
Yeah. Thanks. So. We'll talk a little bit about the EV market and the China growth. We've connected those two subjects simply because China obviously is coming on very strong with finished vehicles in the EV space. But the EV migration continues, obviously, but launches are starting to be delayed as capacities are being put in place and supply chains are being solidified. In this report, we're going to talk about things like charging capacity infrastructure, mineral constraints, and vehicle pricing that'll cause headwinds to sales. And those challenges associated with the move toward EV will continue to provide volatility in sales, much like I just mentioned, and therefore production volume. So those that are supplying EV companies at the moment, you're seeing mixed changes and production volatility and no guaranteed volumes and those kinds of things. That's going to continue, and those who plan for that will benefit financially. And then with China, their increasing participation in the finished vehicle market significantly over the past few years is worth note, obviously, as the rest of the world works to de-risk and limit their capacity on Chinese material. This is another result of our survey here. A couple of graphs that are interesting. No doubt that companies are executing a strategy to reduce their dependency on China for supply, and you see that on the left pie chart there. But our survey shows that about 22%, so kind of the upper left quadrant of that circle, don't really see that as a threat. And some are even sourcing more from China. So even though that's not necessarily a majority, 22%, it's certainly worth note and worth continuing to monitor. In Europe, the non-China strategies are becoming more prevalent. We're seeing France obviously putting legislation against import of vehicles, and recent, I think it was in February, where Germany has issued a German-China policy where they've acknowledged that they're not going to completely decouple from the Chinese economy, but at the same time need to start de-risking. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. But while the migration to EV is undeniable, 55% of the companies over on the right pie chart are using kind of a balanced approach between ICE business or the internal combustion engine business and EV business. So some are actually committed to that ICE business, and others are using a balanced approach. And from our perspective, from Seraph's perspective, we believe that balance to be healthy as we make that transition. And then overall, as EV launches are happening, customer perception is not yet fully understood. So charging is still a problem, and OEMs are collaborating to ease that a little bit with the combination of charging connectors and some of those kind of things, which we'll talk about. However, it's clear that some of those launches are going to be delayed, and the actual volumes are uncertain. And supply availability and components and tooling and equipment and automation and all those kind of things are going to impact those launches. So while Western automakers, with maybe the exception of Tesla, are decoupling from China, we'll call it, or certainly de-risking, they're investing less in China. Their focus and their investment in other regions. So you see at the top here, you see some of the low-cost countries. You see Mexico and Eastern Europe, but at the same time, you see the U.S. in there. So North America is a significant investment, as we've talked about the local for local strategy. So a lot of that is being moved into the U.S. and Mexico.
And I'm not sure if the audience saw in I think it was Wall Street Journal, there was an article on Monday that showed very much the same data as we're showing here, much more investments towards Mexico and the US, and a bit of a reduction in investments towards Europe at the moment.
So launches, as we're seeing, we've talked about launches being delayed a little bit. This is the North American launch plans. And as you can see, if you compare back to April of 2022, launches are being delayed. And a very substantial piece of this are EV launches. And so we noted in our last report that we'll see more launches, but lower volumes, and the number of nameplates in vehicles will increase. That's a recipe for complexity and potential launch chaos, which will have to be understood well and mitigated. And obviously, there are financial implications that need to be considered as well, because in many cases, investments are made, then projects are delayed, and when they are, the sales are obviously delayed along with that, to offset those investments. From a Europe perspective, in the interest of complete transparency, This is our first report where we're including Europe strongly in the report, and so we didn't compare necessarily back to April of 2022, but we are seeing anecdotally similar launch delays in Europe that we see in North America. However, we see that the percentage of EV launches as a percent of the total launches is less than it is in North America, but increasing over time. As we see the launches delay, we expect that to dilute a little bit. Kind of a summary slide with regard to demand. We talked about, when I kind of gave the overview, I talked a little bit about sales, and it's a little bit unpredictable from a volume perspective in the EV space. So as the EV migration continues, it'll be prudent for suppliers to evaluate their investments with significant diligence. There'll be an increasing number of nameplates and vehicles, like we had just mentioned, but those volumes may vary beyond what you expect in your initial business cases for issues like what's on the screen here. So the charging infrastructure and connections used by each of those nameplates, are they specialized, or are they somewhat common? That will affect sales and provide some headwinds. Semiconductor and critical mineral access by battery manufacturers will obviously provide some headwinds, and then supply chains and management capability to support the launches. And we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about some of these as we go forward in the presentation. From a price perspective, we're seeing EVs reduced for a few reasons. Supply chains, I wouldn't suggest that they're mature necessarily in the EV space, but they're increasing in maturity, and the price will naturally reduce as that maturity happens, just based on supply and demand economics. But recently, we've also seen the dominant player, Tesla, reduce their pricing as a sales generation tool, which of course affects the overall average. The average price for a new car in the U.S. recently was about $48,000, and similar in Europe. The ratios are similar in Europe, but specifically using the U.S. as a baseline, approximately $48,000. But for an EV, you can see on this slide, is about $55,000, which is about a 15% increase. And so EVs are still less affordable to many consumers. But even as the price decreases, we see the inventory go up. You see 92,000 units there on the slide. And that suggests to us that sales is not necessarily keeping up with the production as supply chains start to improve and production ramps and those kinds of things, which also is an indicator that the pricing is still prohibitive to many of the consumers.
So wait, just to jump in here as a quick question too, do you see, so of course we have the unions and the labor costs and costs from suppliers increasing, and now it's becoming quite competitive on pricing, at least on the EV front. Do you see, so we've had 3 years of high profits, especially from a few of the OEMs, but they've done quite well there. Most of the OEMs have had good, strong profits. Do you see that now getting squeezed moving into the future years here?
Oh, absolutely. I think with the EV space especially, there's non-traditional OEMs that are entering the market pretty strongly. People like Rivian, Tesla, of course. And we're going to talk about in a few slides. We're going to talk about the Chinese influence of exporting vehicles, finished vehicles. And so as that happens, competition is going to increase, obviously, which is going to drive down price just through supply and demand, the curves, right? I think we've got a question, maybe it's a comment. It says, I believe there's a drop in EV sales in EU because the government strategies are not aligned with infrastructure and bureaucracy for the installation of electric grids. We are going to talk a little bit about that here shortly, because that's a significant issue. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good comment. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. There are some challenges with just commonizing connectors and those kinds of things, but there's also a significant problem with the grids, both in North America and the EU. So A little bit more on pricing. This is just another way to look at the same kind of information. The average new car cost being $48,000, which takes about 43 weeks worth of average income in the U.S. specifically to be able to afford one. The good news is that's reduced this year since the beginning of the year by 2 weeks, but still a challenge for many consumers. And then from a materials perspective, you can see on the chart there all the red being China and how they dominate the material processing and cell components aspects of the supply chain with regard to EVs. So pricing for materials is moderated a little bit in the later half of 2022 and 23, but they're still much higher than historically. The U.S. and the EU are going to have to make strategic investments in material processing and cell components to secure their EV supply chains as they de-risk from China. Clearly, China is dominant in those areas and will remain so without significant investment. But
yeah, and it might be a little. Yeah, sorry, I was just going to jump in. It might be even a little tricky to see it here, but if you look at it, what stood out to me was, of course, the China, all red, but then the little blue one there for the U.S. That is not putting the U.S. in the greatest position at the moment.
Same with Europe. There's not any big bars on here for Europe either. So, so even China doesn't have the capacity, though, to achieve the production of battery supply planned for the EV market. So if we meet our 2030 objectives, what's being projected for EV sales in 2030, even China doesn't have that capacity. So the opportunity for that investment is ripe, but the investment certainly needs to be made, and it needs to be made very quickly in recycling capacity and exploration, which is starting to happen, but China has a substantial lead. And lead times are obviously quite long, as seen in the table on the right. Now, this data actually is from General Motors' earnings call, so we're using this just to kind of punctuate that message from a lithium perspective. So at least General Motors suggests that 5.3 million metric tons of lithium will be required to meet that somewhere between 3.1 million and 5.3 million metric tons to be able to meet the lithium forecast for the 2030 load of plant. Currently, it's 915,000, which is obviously significantly low. Now, right now, they're showing that about 3.6 million is possible. And GM specifically has suggested that they have secured their supply base going forward and projecting 1 million units a year. So but if that's true and they've secured their supply base, it means others are going to be left out in the cold.
One quick correction, just Justin Forty, you're jumping in here. I just wanted to say that the data on the left is from Benchmark Minerals, which is a analysis company, but the information on the right, that's still from General Motors. But
oh, thank you.
Everything else Wade said was correct. Just wanted to get the attribution right.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I for some reason I thought that was part of the GM call. Thank you. So the industry's fretted over charging capability, but we're starting to converge on some standards. So in North America, Tesla has open sourced its proprietary charging connectors, and many OEMs are starting to partner to use it. So that standardization, a lot like USB connectors or HDMI connectors in the consumer electronics space, that standardization will be significant in gaining additional EV sales, as consumers are likely delaying at this point purchases until they can be assured that charging ability is readily available. And step one would be having a connector that can be used. From a charging network perspective, and this happens to be in for Europe, Norway far exceeds other countries with regard to charging capability, and they've got approximately a charger for every 20 vehicles in the country. And of Norway's passenger vehicles on the road in Norway, about 20% of them are currently EVs, and about 84% of new cars sold are EVs. And so they're going to have to continue to increase as well. But you can see from the graph, kind of the more affluent countries are on track to reach in the charging network density required to meet some of the 2030 objectives. But everybody's going to have to step that up. In the U.S., although it's not on the slide here, in the U.S., right now the ratio is about 72 vehicles per charger. And the network's growing quickly, according to the U.S. Department of Energy. But increases will be required there for capability as well. And then this is addressing one of the comments that was made, actually, because just having the charging networks and the connectors for vehicles isn't really enough. It'll take additional infrastructure and public investment, and therefore policy, as the comment came through. To support the EV volumes going forward, which is going to be costly. So this graph on the left happens to be U.S. data, but it's similar in North America, as mentioned by the comment. But since the 1970s up until about 2020, we've seen about 1.5% growth in the need for transmissions or electrical transmission. And so given the decarbonization plan, that growth rate runs to 5.7%, which is an enormous increase. And I can't imagine it being different for Europe, but for North America, 95% of residential transformers can't handle the load expected. And the lead times are growing substantially. And so we've got to start to get more capacity in place. And the comment was spot on that it's going to take a matter of public policy to be able to do that. So a little bit more about China. As North America and Europe reduce their dependency on China, we're seeing China gain strength, at least in the near term. They're importing less and exporting more supplied components, as you can see on the graph on the left. But then on the right, you see that they're exporting more finished vehicles than they import, starting in November of 2022-ish. So that's substantial, the slope of that curve on the left there, or I'm sorry, on the right. Now, what we're seeing is the premium and luxury market is still protected, but the entry-level vehicles are starting to suffer due to China's strengthening. Especially
so we are seeing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, especially in domestic China.
Exactly. The struggle for the luxury brands, though, is the fact that if you come out with a very nice sedan, $95,000, and it's an EV, and you're entering the China market with this nice new vehicle, but you're still selling an ICE for 90, and it's a big SUV, and you're a luxury brand. What we're seeing from the data is showing that the Chinese continue buying the larger vehicle that is internal combustion engine because of the status symbol of having this larger vehicle versus, say, a EV sedan, which is impacting those premium automakers that are coming out with EV vehicles in China.
So for total EV sales globally, as of 2022, China has captured about 58% of the market. Now, a lot of that is for the Chinese domestic market, and that seems to be increasing rapidly. Chinese brands are increasing their market share, while external countries, you can see on the right, are starting to reduce. Again, premium brands being a little bit of an exception at the moment, but the lower entry-level vehicles are being dominated by China, led by BYD. And this talks a little bit about trade with China. So the U.S. has publicly, for a while now, since 2018, had a policy of starting to try to reduce their dependency on Chinese manufacturing. So they've been able to reduce Chinese imports from 21% to 16% in that period of time, mainly due to tariffs and some movement of operations to other Asian countries. But Europe is a little bit different. Despite efforts to de-risk the Europe economic links with China, imports have nearly doubled actually in that same period, including sensitive technology and critical minerals. Obviously, like we talked about, how China has a strong hold on that. The trade relations are highly imbalanced, and the officials are starting to react to that pretty substantially. So, interesting, European car makers have benefited a little bit because of the U.S.-China trade war, because they've had booming sales in China, and that relationship's been worth somewhere in the $24 billion last year. And then this continues that kind of similar message that since the end of 2021, the U.S. has whittled away at their trade deficit with China, but and have started to work to become less dependent. But Europe saw, the EU, I should say, starting at the beginning of 2021, had a sharp increase in their dependency, and they recognize that they can't completely decouple from China, as China accounts for basically 14% of the entire global exports. But they're emphasizing a de-risking plan instead. So we've seen that, as mentioned before, we've seen France with their legislation that they've introduced, as well as the German China policy. So that was a lot, I know, talking about EV and China's impact as well. But I think we have a lot of questions that have been.
Yeah, one really, really good question, of course, comes from Chris Cummins here. I appreciate you sending this one through. Ford lost $60,000 per each EV sold and projected to lose $4.5 billion this year on EV division per last earnings report 2 weeks ago. It's one of the biggest problems, and we have it in one of the quotes early on in the presentation, is truly the architecture of the vehicles. So Tesla created the vehicle architecture from the ground up. And with the EV vehicles that have come out from many of the traditional OEMs, they have just taken product and slammed it together to get their first vehicle out there. I had the great opportunity to go into a benchmarking facility by a company that we partner a lot with, CareSoft, and they were benchmarking a North American OEM EV vehicle with the Model Y. And you could almost see it was double the amount of components. Of course, the OEMs, the traditional OEMs, are going to catch up quickly through this type of benchmark. But for right now, they're behind. So Ford, and this is public knowledge, Ford has actually created a partnership with VW that their next vehicle that's coming out is going to be based upon the architecture of the ID.4. So they are well aware of this, but it's going to take a couple of years for them to catch up. And until then, as long as they're coming out with vehicles, EV vehicles have been slammed together, to Chris' point, and from the earnings call, that's going to hurt them financially as well. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Chris also commented that only Tesla makes money when the prices drop on EVs, and that's a first mover advantage. That's true. Tesla, I think Jay responded here that Tesla's not really a new company anymore, and they've got the advantage of scale now. And so as these other companies like Thomas suggested, if they put it on, like Volkswagen put it on the ID.4 platform, they start to get some scale, similar scale.
Then Jay asked a very good question in regards to inventory per price point on EV vehicles. So, for example, what is the inventory for 40,000 versus an $80,000 vehicle? And if we have any data on that, we do not have data on that. The question is really good because I've seen some reports coming out that they're starting to fill some of the dealer lots with EV vehicles that are not being sold. But in this report, we do not cover those details. But one of the last questions that I'm going to have for everyone is, what would you like to see in the next report? So that's a great question there, Jay, that hopefully we can bring along for the next one, as long as we can get the good data on that.
Yeah, and the last question I see is, what's the team's view from Adrian Robinson? Thanks, Adrian, for the question. What's the team's view of the impact of AI on the volatility in the market, and that's autonomous driving? I don't see. I don't, and maybe it'd be interesting to open that up to anybody that wants to answer. But my perspective on that is AI is just going to be an extension of the electric vehicles. I mean, Tesla's already obviously planning to extend that as part of their kind of architecture and platform. So I think that it's just going to be an extension. I'm not really seeing necessarily that it will have a huge impact on volumes and volatility. It'll have an impact on a lot of other things, of course, but not necessarily on that volatility. But I don't know if anybody else has a perspective on that. No? Okay, well, then we'll just all assume I'm right.
We all know that's always true, Wade, always. Do you think that what you mentioned in regards to the incumbent OEMs will force them to continue to invest in ICE to fund the EV business? Another good question by Jay. I think he's trying to put us on the spot here, Wade, and make sure we get some good answers out there. No, I think that's a great question. What we've seen is heavy reduction from the OEMs and from the even the supply base into ICE. And my answer to that is, I don't see it in the short term. I think they're okay with the engines and the transmissions and the powertrain for the ICE as it is. And the reason why I say that, we work with a few different suppliers that are involved in ICE, and last year and this year, we were going to use this as a quote in the beginning of the presentation, actually, originally. There's a strategy of what's known as the last man standing. So let's pick on somebody that makes any type of ICE components. The OEMs want to try to lock them in to be their partner for up till about 2024, up till 2035, long-term contracts. And maybe before, the OEM had 4 to 5 suppliers, and they're going to go down to 1, maybe 2, and the rest of them will fall away. And some of these decisions, contracts, and deals were done last year, and some of the other OEMs are focusing on concluding that this year. So my answer to that is, I don't think there is going to be too many investments. It's going to be more of a focus of last man standing.
Good. So we'll move on here to inflation and costs.
Right. So I think we covered a lot of this already, but one thing that we will take a look at here is the shipping cost. And what does that look like? What does inflation have as an impact on Europe and US in regards to commodity pricing? So if we go to the next slide. This slide threw me off first. This is very important that we focus on the actual graph here, that is percentage change year over year. Because if somebody looks at this and says, well, the producer price index, yeah, it increased, but now it's just dropped. No, what this is saying is, yes, it took a massive increase, and then to some degree has now stabilized at this higher producer price index, somewhere between 20 and 25, depending on where you are in Europe and with the United States. So that impact from a cost standpoint is still very, very real, and it hasn't come down. Yes, that massive growth came, and we don't see another massive growth, but we saw the growth. Costs have increased, and then now it's starting to plateau to some degree. However, with union negotiations, with competitiveness in regards to low-cost countries, just labor in general, we don't think this is the complete end of it. We do foresee some more oscillations, or at least some more steps up. So we're not trying to be too pessimistic, but unfortunately, for all the great sales and business people inside of the tiered supply base, you are going to continue having to have these discussions with your customers, unfortunately. So if we go to the next slide. Here you see the reduction in shipping costs. Just in general, this is just a data point for you to have. Yes, it spiked, but it has come down a little bit higher than pre-pandemic rates, but at least that's some positive news in the industry. If we go to the next slide. So total exports from Mexico into the US has increased, and obviously we've talked enough about Mexico and the importance for us in the US, but the passenger car imports from Mexico has actually declined a little bit here, and that's I think from a consumer standpoint, or from a choice of vehicles. In the US, we love our trucks, we love our SUVs. In Mexico, yes, there are some trucks and SUVs that are being built there, obviously by GM and Stellantis and so forth, but many other of the other OEMs are building more smaller passenger cars in Mexico. Next slide, please. So we're starting to see some of the commodity pricing coming down here, but they're not down to the pre-pandemic levels. I see that they're dropping a little bit here, but as just mentioned earlier, labor costs, I don't think that we're at the end of the story there. I think that's going to continue, and that's going to keep some of these commodity prices higher. So if you had contracts and you based your business without some type of commodity index agreement with the OEMs, you're going to have to go in there and really have some tough discussions, because I don't foresee this to come down much more than what we see here. Okay, and this is our last slide for everyone that's been able to maintain attention and not scroll too much on LinkedIn and Instagram here, but this is, to me, a very interesting portion of the survey that we did. So if we look at all the companies out there, they're doing the right thing. You have to try to attack on two fronts. One is to attack and try to bring up pricing and try to renegotiate with your customers, or if you're an OEM, you're able to just increase your prices to the consumers. The other part is to attack your cost structure. And that we see as you divide. One is your material cost, which is X% of your bill of your overall cost structure. So you're going to attack those, try to renegotiate the pricing. The other portion is, what can you control today in your operations, and how are you attacking that? And if we look at the pie chart and we see 21% is resistant to change within the organization, and then talent shortage. And this is really what Seraph sees on a daily basis. And when we're talking about talent shortage, we're really missing some of that real problem solving. So talent in general, just you can find bodies and fill positions, but real talent that know what they're doing and solve the root cause of the problems that you're seeing in your business. So there's a shortage there. And then if you look at resistance to change within the organization, as being a big portion of that too. So once maybe somebody's created a business case, which I actually had a discussion with an OEM very recently, somebody's developed a business case that was quite positive, to make some improvements in regards to their efficiency. It was shut down because the organization didn't quite want to take the change and do it. So when we look at it, it's tough to get your full price increase to the customers. You can fight there, so maybe you're getting a little portion of that. With the suppliers, you're getting a little portion. And then unfortunately, often with a lot of the internal continuous improvement work here, we're seeing a real shortage in there where really you can have a pretty good impact on your business.
Yeah, and I'd add to that that you'll also see way down there at the bottom, actually, or towards the bottom, continuous improvement initiatives, and obviously a vast majority of companies suggest that they're endeavoring into continuous improvement initiatives. But for the reasons on the right, one should question the effectivity of those because of those initiatives, because typically what we see in our kind of our practice and when we deal with clients, everybody has a continuous improvement initiative. They're always working towards continuously improving. But what that used to mean was offsetting your productivity from a supplier, for example, offsetting your productivity of whatever you got to get back to the OEM by the end of the year. And so that's kind of the target, and maybe some profitability improvement on top of that. But the productivity equivalent productivity these days is for example, you give 3% or 5% or whatever you get back from a productivity perspective, but the increasing costs are substantially higher than that. And the reason I bring that up is because typically companies have a continuous improvement initiative or a program that works toward incremental improvement to offset that productivity. And what's required in these circumstances is more step improvement. You've got to have initiatives that look at it at a grander scale. Things like the one below that, consolidating plant footprint. That's more of a kind of a step improvement action.
Very good. Thank you, Wade, and thank you, everyone. This is the end of the presentation. We still have some open the floor for questions or comments. We did receive a great comment here from Chris as well, and worth noting that the Mexican peso is up about 15% versus US dollars year to trend. So year to date, so that trend we need to keep an eye on. Couldn't agree with you more on that one. Yeah, any other questions, comments, topics that you would like to see in the next report? Anything that we can do better? Maybe more jokes, I'm not sure, Wade.
Wade's not great at jokes.
Be funnier.
Honestly, the last slide for me was worth the price of admission, which was free, but it was still worth the price of admission.
This one?
Yes. My organization lives in this world right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And just for everyone's knowledge, everyone that's registered, anyone that's part of this, we will send you a PDF version of the presentation that we sent today as well.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
All right, guys.
Well, if that's it, I'll say a few and then turn it over to you, Thomas. But for all that have participated in this, we very much appreciate it. And our emails are available via the meeting notices and that kind of thing, or you can certainly reach out on LinkedIn if you're driving along somewhere and you're thinking about this presentation. You say, it really would have been interesting if we would have had this information. Jot it down and send it to us. We'd love to hear from you.